I was jolted awake at exactly 3:12 a.m. by a notification from my equipment tracker app. At first, I thought it was a false alarm, maybe a raccoon brushed past a motion sensor. But when I tapped open the GPS feed, my heart sank. The screen showed a blinking red dot moving away from my property at a steady pace of 12 miles per hour. That red dot was my tractor. Not just any tractor. My custom John Deere 6120M, retrofitted with hydraulic lifts, precision tillage attachments, and a solar-synced GPS panel. The thing was a beast, and it was vanishing into the night while I stood in my pajamas, barefoot on the porch, holding my phone with disbelief tightening my chest. And the kicker? Parked right where the tractor used to be was an HOA violation notice slapped onto an empty wooden fence post, like some twisted calling card from a petty villain. It was signed by none other than Karen Holloway, the neighborhood's self-declared queen of the HOA. By the time I threw on jeans and sprinted to the barn, it was clear. No break-in signs, no shattered locks, no damaged gates. The padlock was missing entirely, as if someone had calmly and legally removed it. There were fresh tire tracks in the dirt, deep and unmistakably made by the weight of the tractor being driven away. A few yards further down the private trail leading out of my property, I found scuff marks and something else, skid lines from ramp. Someone had backed up a trailer or maybe even rolled it out under power. I stood there in the darkness with adrenaline burning in my blood, muttering to myself, and I already knew who had done it. Karen. Of course it was Karen. For the past 6 months, she'd made it her personal crusade to make my life miserable. She fined me for grass overgrowth when my drought-resistant patch hit 3.2 inches. She complained about my barn color, oakwood brown, claiming it clashed with her imported Tuscany-inspired garden. She even sent a cease and desist because my scarecrow, apparently, reflected hostile rural energy. But this was a whole new level. I joked with my buddy Walt once that Karen would probably steal my tractor if it didn't require a key. Turns out, I underestimated her. She did it even with the key. The sheriff's department showed up an hour later after my call, took one long look at the HOA note and the tire tracks, and gave me a shrug that made me want to throw something. According to them, since it was an HOA matter and the notice suggested unauthorized property storage, it might be considered a civil dispute. Civil dispute? My $95,000 tractor had been kidnapped, and the only thing they could do was file a report and tell me to take it up with my neighborhood association. It felt like someone robbed my house and left behind a note that said, "Sorry, too tacky to keep." I stood on the edge of the road watching the squad car disappear, and that's when I remembered the one thing Karen didn't know. Last spring, after Walt convinced me we were living in the age of digital cattle rustlers, I installed a covert GPS tracker inside the tractor's rear lift casing. It was solar-powered, invisible unless you disassembled the housing, and updated every 30 seconds. I pulled up the app again. The dot had stopped moving. It had settled, oddly, just 3 blocks down, right in the center of a cluster of high-end homes near the golf course. One house in particular stood out. Karen's. Now, Karen's property wasn't exactly built for storing farm equipment. She lived in what she obnoxiously called the Holloway Estate, a 2-story cream stucco monstrosity with imported gravel driveways, fake Greek columns, and a rose trellis so large it could probably house a family of possums. I hopped in my pickup and cruised by slowly. It was still dark, but something caught my eye. Her side yard had a new tarp setup covering what looked like an excavation ramp. I couldn't be sure from that angle, but my gut screamed that she hadn't just stolen the tractor. She'd stored it. Somewhere on-site. Possibly underground. I called Walt. If anyone would know how to get answers without setting off alarms, it was him. Walt used to be a military mechanic, and now spent his days fixing antique tractors and teaching me how to outwit HOA politics using legal loopholes and duck decoys. He arrived just after sunrise in his beat-up GMC, holding a thermos in one hand and a pair of binoculars in the other. We parked a block away and set up behind his camper shell to do some old-school recon. We took turns tracking the GPS and scoping out the backyard through the side alley. What we saw confirmed every suspicion. There was movement, mechanical movement, coming from under her back deck. The side of her house had a camouflaged access ramp built along the bushes, hidden from plain sight. We even heard faint whirring sounds, like hydraulic adjustments or panel tools grinding. Karen hadn't just hidden the tractor, she was working on it. But for what? By now I was half furious, half fascinated. The woman had turned her suburban backyard into a black market tractor garage. The level of audacity was surreal. I wanted to scream, break in, call the FBI, anything, but Walt held me back. No, we go smart. You want her embarrassed, not just arrested. We're gonna do this like a slow-cooked brisket. Real tender, public, and unforgettable. He was right. Calling the police again would only get us another shrug. But showing up to the next HOA meeting with undeniable proof? That had potential. Especially if the evidence was more than GPS data. So we planned, we'd get a clean visual. Maybe even a recording. Then we'd bring it right to the court of neighborhood opinion, Karen's favorite playground, and drop the hammer. As the sun rose higher, the tractor's signal stayed still. Karen thought she had pulled off the perfect heist. But she had no idea she'd stolen a machine that talked, and it was about to expose her whole twisted plot. The next morning, I couldn't concentrate on anything. My coffee tasted like rust, my hands shook when I tried to feed the chickens, and even the dog noticed something was off. The GPS signal hadn't moved all night, still pulsing quietly from beneath Karen's property. I refreshed it every hour. Walt called me just after noon and told me he'd been thinking. He said, if she's hiding that beast in her basement, she's not planning to return it. That woman's up to something bigger, man. She's not just a petty thief, she's got a plan. I knew he was right. Karen never did anything halfway. She once built a 30-foot banner declaring "Weeds are war," just because someone had dandelions in their yard. The idea that she'd go through all the trouble to steal a tractor and then not flaunt it somehow? Unthinkable. She wanted to use it. The question was, how? And for what? We needed eyes on the inside. Not just from the street, not just guesses. We needed proof. Karen's fortress of a house didn't make that easy. There were security cameras on the porch, motion lights in the front yard, and a large ceramic bulldog statue next to her door that I'm still not convinced wasn't a real surveillance robot. So we came up with a plan. Walt said he still had an old set of door-to-door solar panel uniforms from his nephew's summer job. Khaki polo shirts, cargo pants, and clipboards with a fake company logo. He even added laminated name badges. We looked ridiculous, but nobody questioned the solar panel guys. They were like mailmen, ignored by default. We timed our visit for mid-afternoon, when the sun was scorching and most people stayed inside. We walked up her flagstone pathway, trying not to look like undercover farmers. Karen opened the door in a silk robe, holding a glass of lemonade like she was shooting a lifestyle commercial. She gave us that wide-eyed condescending stare like we were bugs crawling on her imported tiles. Walt did all the talking, claiming we were running a neighborhood assessment for solar rebate. Karen, predictably, said she already had Tesla panels, then added that environmental work is very important to people of her class. I almost lost it right there. She stood there blabbering about sustainability while a stolen farm vehicle sat somewhere beneath her designer lawn. But then, as she stepped out to point at her roofline, I caught something. A low whirring hum, barely audible, coming from under the floor. It wasn't AC. It wasn't a water heater. It was the sound of hydraulics, the kind you only heard in machines not meant to live underground. Walt nodded subtly. He heard it too. We didn't stay long, didn't want to push it, but we left with something valuable. Walt's clipboard wasn't just a prop. He'd hollowed it out and fit it with a tiny wide-angle lens linked to his phone. It had been recording from the moment Karen opened the door. Later that evening, when we reviewed the footage, we caught something wild. Behind Karen, just before she stepped outside, a reflection from a glass cabinet showed the tractor's massive rear wheel visible through a partially open basement door. It was quick, blurry, but it was there. We zoomed in. I knew that tread. I'd replaced those tires myself. That was my machine. We couldn't believe it. She'd actually converted her basement to store the tractor. Walt pointed out how she'd have to widen the access door, reinforce the foundation, and probably remove a wall to fit it in there. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. Karen had been planning this. She'd studied my property, noted my routines, probably even waited for the exact moment I was at the hardware store that day to make her move. And she was trying to hide the evidence like it was part of a remodel. I wanted to go straight to the police with the footage, but Walt convinced me to hold off. He said if we went now, Karen might still weasel her way out of it with her HOA connections and manipulations. We needed to expose her publicly, somewhere she couldn't spin it or play victim. Somewhere like the upcoming HOA community review session. Karen never missed a meeting, and better yet, she always made them about her. We could ambush her with undeniable proof, right in front of everyone who'd ever rolled their eyes at her tyranny. But we needed more. A bigger, cleaner shot of the tractor. Something that even a blind squirrel could recognize. That's when we got the idea to stake out the property from the old hiking trail behind the neighborhood. The trail ran parallel to the backyards of the estate row, including Karen's house. We hiked out there with binoculars, a drone Walt rigged with a silent fan, and a cooler full of snacks. From our new vantage point behind the hedge, we spotted her backyard renovation zone. Shrubs had been freshly planted in awkward patterns that conveniently covered a sloped concrete path leading to the back of her house. It wasn't a driveway, but it was wide enough for something big to be rolled down or up. Walt launched the drone, careful to keep it low and slow. The moment it passed over the hedge and hovered near her deck, we got the jackpot. Through a side window, the drone cam captured the unmistakable front grille of my tractor. Covered in a tarp, yes, but the emblem was visible and the serial number etched into the steel was clear under zoom. We were nearly there. The footage, the GPS, the sound recordings, it was all lining up. But just as Walt was bringing the drone back, disaster almost struck. Karen's motion sensors kicked in and a sprinkler system went off like a defense grid. We ducked as water blasted into the hedges, and one of her side lights began flashing red. Walt cursed and hit the emergency return. The drone came back a little damp but intact. We packed up quickly and hiked out under cover of dusk. That night, I barely slept. I kept watching the footage, refreshing the GPS app, reading HOA bylaws online about theft and property enforcement. It was all pointing to one thing. This wasn't just about a stolen tractor anymore. This was about a woman who thought she could do anything, bend the law, manipulate authority, and stomp on the people around her without consequences. And she almost pulled it off. Almost. Because she didn't know the machine she stole was quietly screaming for help the whole time. The next HOA meeting was 3 days away. I marked it on my calendar and drew a red line under the words, "Showtime." The night before the HOA meeting, Walt and I stayed up until nearly 2 a.m. perfecting our plan. We went over the footage from the drone, re-watched Karen's reflection in the clipboard cam, and stitched the clips together into a seamless timeline that made it impossible to deny what she had done. Walt even added a dramatic freeze frame on the tractor's serial number, zooming in while labeling it, "Property of Ethan J." in bright red text, just in case any of the HOA members were visually challenged. We practiced the timing of the reveal, when I'd press the speaker button to trigger the Bluetooth signal that would remotely start the tractor's engine from under Karen's basement. I wanted that sound to rip through the meeting like thunder. There's a certain power in engines, especially when they're roaring through the middle of a public hearing filled with petty neighbors, lemon bars, and folding chairs. The morning of the meeting, I wore the only blazer I owned, dusted off my work boots just enough to look presentable, and brought along a flash drive, a portable speaker, and a copy of the police report they had initially shrugged off. I also brought the HOA bylaws, with 3 clauses highlighted in neon, one about unauthorized property seizure, another about misuse of community authority, and one more that Walt insisted on including just for dramatic flair, something about conduct unbecoming an HOA officer. It read like something from a military tribunal. Fitting, considering what was about to happen. We arrived 10 minutes early. The community center was already half full. Folding chairs lined up in 2 neat rows, a table at the front where Karen always sat with her oversized gavel and laminated agenda. And there she was, in her usual glory. Floral blouse, high heels, her nameplate prepositioned in front of the central mic like she was hosting a presidential debate. She glanced at me and Walt with mild annoyance, as if we were just more items on her schedule to swat away. I smiled wider than necessary, tipped my hat, and sat right up front. Let her feel the pressure. The meeting began the way all HOA meetings begin. Slow, drowsy, full of complaints about mailbox paint, lawn height, someone's wind chimes, and whether or not solar panels were reflecting bad vibes into Karen's kitchen. I waited patiently, gripping the flash drive in my pocket like it was a grenade. When Karen reached the "Any New Business" section of the agenda, I stood up. I asked politely to address the board, which of course she tried to deny. But the bylaws clearly stated that any resident with a property concern could have 3 minutes of floor time. She knew it. She forced a smile that made her look like she had swallowed a pine cone and nodded for me to proceed. I pulled out the flash drive and plugged it into the community projector, which Walt had conveniently checked earlier to make sure it worked flawlessly. The moment the screen lit up, the room shifted. Eyes turned. Phones went down. The first image. My tractor, serene and safe on my farm, labeled "before theft." Then came the footage. The GPS pinging. The tire tracks. Karen's signature on the HOA violation notice. Then the footage of her front door, the clipboard cam catching the humming noise beneath her feet, and that glorious still image. My tractor's grill gleaming behind the tarp in her basement window, clear as daylight. Some people gasped. One guy actually muttered, "No way," out loud. But the moment that really broke the silence was when I clicked my speaker remote and the sound of my tractor's engine exploded into the room like a chainsaw through drywall. The whole building vibrated. That low, unmistakable growl of heavy machinery in motion sent a visible wave through the crowd. I pressed it again, and the engine revved louder, aggressive, undeniable. Karen's face twisted from smug to pale in real time. She opened her mouth, stammered something about fabricated footage, but it was too late. Lisa, one of the more outspoken members who had been on the receiving end of Karen's fines before, stood up and said, "That's your basement, Karen. You hosted a garden party down there last week. I recognize the curtains. You told us no one was allowed to tour because of renovations. You lied. That opened the floodgates." Others began chiming in. People who'd stayed silent before now started asking questions. About old fines, about bogus infractions, about how Karen had been allowed to enforce so many rules unchecked. A few even pulled up screenshots of similar situations where she had overstepped. Then someone pointed out that she had fined me for storing unsightly machinery, while apparently using my unsightly machinery to build her HOA anniversary float. Yes. Turns out she'd planned to turn my tractor into some kind of mobile parade display, complete with pink streamers and a papier-mâché eagle holding the HOA logo. That alone would have been a felony in the world of agriculture. Karen tried to gavel things back to order, but it was pointless. Her gavel actually slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a hollow knock that echoed like a final verdict. The board motioned for an emergency recess. While they huddled in the corner whispering like high schoolers in detention, 2 uniformed officers walked into the meeting. Someone had called the station ahead of time. Walt claimed it was just a coincidence, but I don't believe in those. The officers took one look at the footage, heard the speaker engine still humming in the background, and nodded. Karen asked if they had a warrant. One of them said, "We do now." Then they escorted her out through the side door, ignoring her screeches about defamation, her rights, and something about community beautification. The room exploded with applause. Not the kind of wild, cheering ovation you see in movies, more like the stunned, grateful kind. Like a fog had lifted. People were smiling. Neighbors who had never spoken before suddenly leaned in, introduced themselves, joked about who would be president now. Lisa was already being encouraged to run for the next term. Walt shook my hand with a grin that could have split firewood. I didn't stay long after that. I didn't need to. The storm had passed and Karen's reign was over. But as I drove back home with the tractor's hum still echoing in my ears, I realized something deeper. This wasn't just about getting back at a thief. It was about standing up to the kind of entitlement that hides behind rules and uses them like weapons. And the best part? The weapon she used to try and break me, my tractor, ended up being the very thing that buried her. By the next morning, the story had already gone viral. Someone from the HOA meeting had uploaded a low-quality video of the projector footage and the roar of the tractor echoing through the room. It spread like wildfire across local Facebook groups, then hit Reddit, where a thread titled, "HOA Queen hid stolen tractor in her basement," racked up thousands of comments in hours. News sites picked it up not long after, with headlines ranging from factual to absolutely absurd. "Basement Tractor Heist Shakes Suburbia" was one. Another read, "Karen's Hidden Farm, the Cultivator Conspiracy." My phone didn't stop buzzing for 2 days straight. Strangers were messaging me to share similar HOA horror stories, and even my aunt in Nebraska called to ask if the woman in the video was the same Karen who once tried to sue a mailbox for being crooked. Karen, meanwhile, was in full meltdown mode. After the police took her in for questioning, she was released on bail the same evening, but something had shifted. Her carefully crafted image was in ruins. The same neighbors she used to bark orders at were now openly mocking her. Someone put up a handmade sign at the entrance to the neighborhood that said, "Now entering tractor theft territory. Lock your lawnmowers." Someone else printed stickers that said, "Powered by Karen," and slapped them on their sheds. Kids were driving past her house on scooters making tractor noises and revving toy engines. She tried to hold her head high and pretend like it didn't matter, but the way her curtains stayed shut all day said otherwise. Her husband, Bill, whom no one ever really saw before, finally emerged into daylight. A tall, quiet man with a permanent look of mild confusion, he stood on the porch the day after the meeting and addressed the neighborhood. "It was bizarre," he said. "I had no idea what she was doing. I just thought she was building a wine cellar." Then he apologized to me personally and offered to help haul the tractor out of their basement. I didn't take him up on it, but I appreciated the gesture. Honestly, I felt a little bad for him. Living with Karen must have been like camping inside a tornado for 20 years. The HOA board, now in total disarray, held an emergency session to remove Karen from her position. It wasn't even close. Unanimous vote. Lisa, the one who had called out Karen during the meeting, was elected interim president on the spot. She immediately announced a repeal of most of Karen's bizarre rules, including the infamous porch decor approval process and the single-shade flower bed guideline. She also proposed a community gathering to restore the neighborhood spirit, and to everyone's surprise, she invited me and Walt to host it on my farm. I wasn't sure at first. I'm not a party planner. But Walt loved the idea and promised to handle the grill if I handled the tractor ride. It felt like a fitting celebration. We scheduled the event for Saturday. By then, the police investigation was well underway. They'd found several pieces of equipment Karen had hoarded in her basement over the years, mostly decorative items she'd claimed were abandoned, like lawn gnomes, mailboxes, even a neighbor's wheelbarrow. Apparently, Karen had a compulsion for reclaiming property she felt violated her aesthetic standard. One officer referred to her as a petty hoarder with a power complex. Her charges included grand theft, trespassing, misuse of authority, and illegal structural modifications to her home. The last one hit her the hardest. Turns out, Karen had removed a load-bearing wall in her basement to make room for the tractor, and now the foundation was sinking. Her own house was collapsing because of the very thing she stole. When Saturday came, the farm was alive with energy. Families brought kids, neighbors who'd never spoken before mingled freely, and Walt had 2 grills going full blast with burgers and ribs. I'd pulled the tractor up to the open lawn and parked it with a sign that read, "Recovered from the dungeon." Walt added speakers to it that played engine sounds on loop, and someone set up a selfie station in front of the grill with plastic pitchforks and cowboy hat. It was corny, but it worked. People laughed, took photos, and for once, the neighborhood felt like an actual community instead of a battleground. Even better, the event gave people a chance to share their own Karen stories. Turns out, I wasn't the only one who'd been targeted. One guy said Karen fined him $200 because his sprinkler sprayed into the air too enthusiastically. Another recalled being forced to repaint their fence 3 times in one summer because the color reflected poorly on property values. The more they shared, the more everyone realized just how much control she had tried to exert over their lives. It wasn't just about stolen property, it was about stolen peace of mind. Toward the end of the day, Lisa took the microphone and thanked everyone for coming. Then, in front of the whole crowd, she presented me with a framed certificate that said, HOA Hero, for services against tyranny. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped it. Walt made a speech too, which involved more grilling metaphors than necessary, but the message was clear. We'd stood up to a bully and come out stronger. The funniest moment came when a kid, no older than 8, asked me if he could drive the stolen tractor. I told him maybe in 10 years. His mom snapped a photo of him saluting in front of it like it was a war memorial. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. As the sun dipped below the trees, people began to pack up, lingering longer than usual, like they didn't want the day to end. I stood there with Walt, looking at the tractor, the crowd, the smoky haze from the grill, and realized something I hadn't expected. This whole mess, this ridiculous saga with Karen, had done something no HOA initiative ever could. It had brought us together. Through chaos, yes, but it worked. Karen, of course, didn't show up. Her house was still shuttered tight, her car gone from the driveway. Rumor had it she was staying with her sister in another state while trying to fight the charges. But everyone knew the damage was done, not just legally, but socially. Even if she came back, she'd never wield that power again. She'd become a punchline, a cautionary tale, a meme. And as petty as it sounded, it felt good knowing that the same woman who fined me for growing tomatoes too close to the sidewalk was now being fined herself, by real authorities, for everything she thought she was above. As people left, many shook my hand, some even hugged me. It was strange, being thanked for something that had started with a robbery. But maybe that's how some victories begin. Not with grand intentions, but with something stolen, something lost, and the choice to stand up and do something about it. I locked up the barn, turned off the porch light, and watched the last car drive away down the dusty road. My tractor sat quietly in its place, back where it belonged. And for the first time in a long time, so did peace. The trial came faster than anyone expected. Karen's lawyer tried everything to delay it, motion after motion, citing stress, public harassment, even a claim that the tractor incident was a misinterpreted community enhancement project. But the judge wasn't buying it. The evidence was overwhelming, the media attention was relentless, and the court system had no interest in dragging it out any longer. I was summoned as a key witness, and I showed up to court in the same boots I'd worn the day the tractor disappeared. It felt symbolic, like I was dragging every step of that journey into the courtroom, dirt and all. Karen sat at the defense table looking nothing like the ruler of suburbia she once pretended to be. Her signature pearl necklace was gone, her once perfect hairstyle now looked like it had been fought over by a weed whacker. She tried to avoid eye contact with me. Her lawyer, A man with too much gel in his hair and a habit of dramatically sighing, made his opening statement like he was on a daytime courtroom drama. He claimed Karen had accidentally acquired the tractor due to a misunderstanding about property line authority and HOA administrative right. The judge actually leaned forward and asked, "Are you trying to say she thought she owned the tractor because she runs the neighborhood watch?" The silence that followed was deafening. When it was my turn to testify, I laid it all out: how I discovered the theft, how the GPS tracker worked, how we collected footage, and how she'd modified her basement to store the stolen machine like it was her personal prize. I even showed the footage again, this time on the court's overhead monitor. When the tractor's engine blared through the speakers, just like it had during the HOA meeting, the entire courtroom jolted. A couple jurors laughed. Even the bailiff smirked. But it was Karen's own words, caught during a phone call with her husband, that sealed her fate. The police had obtained the recording as part of the investigation. She'd said, and I quote, "If that redneck thinks I'll let his eyesore sit on this street another day, he's dumber than his chickens." That played during the third day of the trial, and you could see the jurors shift in their seat. It wasn't just theft anymore, it was personal, petty, vindictive. And the jury didn't like petty people pretending to be powerful. The verdict came quickly. Guilty on 3 counts: theft of agricultural equipment, unlawful entry onto private property, and illegal structural modification without a permit. The judge sentenced her to 200 hours of community service, a hefty fine to cover damages, and mandatory counseling for her overzealous authority issues. But the most satisfying part wasn't the punishment. It was the court order that required Karen to publicly apologize at the next HOA meeting and step down permanently from any leadership roles within the community. Her reign was officially over. The apology didn't go well. She showed up, barely made it to the podium, and muttered a few lines written by her lawyer. But then she broke character. Halfway through, she snapped. She threw down the paper, called the entire neighborhood ungrateful sheep, and shouted that I had set her up. Lisa motioned to cut her mic, and someone from the crowd shouted, "Enjoy the gardening gloves, Karen." That was the last time we ever saw her at a public event. She moved out 2 weeks later. Her husband stayed behind, quietly signing the deed to his name and turning over half the backyard for a new community garden project. He even showed up with mulch one afternoon and asked Walt for help with a raised bed. Walt gave him a nod and handed him a shovel like they'd always been neighbors. As for me, life finally settled. The tractor was back where it belonged, and the damage to my property had been repaired. I took a weekend to repaint the barn doors, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The work felt different now, lighter. I'd earned it. The barn, the land, the quiet, everything had a new kind of peace. I didn't hear from Karen again, though rumors floated around about her trying to start another HOA in a smaller town nearby. Apparently, that effort failed when someone Googled her name and found the viral video titled, "Karen's Basement Tractor Dungeon." It had over 3 million views by then and counting. A few months after the dust had settled, the town held its annual 4th of July parade. Usually, I didn't participate, just watched from a lawn chair with iced tea in hand. But this year, the committee invited me to join. Not just as a participant, but as the Grand Marshal. I didn't know what to say. I tried to politely decline, but Walt wasn't having it. He showed up with a trailer, rigged the tractor with speakers, mounted red, white, and blue streamers on every edge, and even installed a flagpole that towered above the cab. He called it the Justice Machine. When the parade day arrived, the entire neighborhood lined the streets, cheering, laughing, waving signs. One said, "We break for tractors, unless Karen's driving." Another read, "Cultivated Justice." Kids rode bikes behind me, and even Lisa walked alongside, handing out homemade stickers that said, "No more Karens, just gardens." I drove slow, honking every few seconds, the engine humming beneath me like a victory song. It wasn't just about the tractor anymore, It was a celebration of resilience, of standing up for what's right, of taking back peace from someone who thought she owned it. Walt rode shotgun, wearing a straw hat and tossing candy to the crowd. At one point, he leaned over and said, "You know, for a guy who didn't want trouble, you sure stirred up the whole state." I laughed and told him, "I didn't stir anything. Karen just picked the wrong farm." Later that evening, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped low and the cicadas hummed through the trees. The lights of the barn glowed soft behind me, the tractor parked beneath them like a loyal dog finally home. I watched fireworks crackle in the distance, sipping a cold drink, feeling like the weight of months had finally lifted. Not because Karen had been punished, not because I'd won anything, but because people had finally come together. They saw what happens when someone misuses power. They stood up, they laughed, they changed things. Maybe that's what real justice looks like. Not in a courtroom or a headline, but in a neighbor handing you a pie after years of silence. In a kid pointing at your tractor and saying, "That's the one that beat the bad lady." In the end, Karen tried to take something that didn't belong to her. My property, my peace, my freedom to live without fear of absurd rules. But what she gave me instead was far more valuable. She gave me back a neighborhood. She gave me a story. And every time I hear that engine start up, I remember how close I came to letting it all go, and how grateful I am that I didn't.